the Baen Free Radio Hour.
On the podcast, super AIs have taken over the world. Please stay calm while changes are taking place. There is nothing to fear, nothing to fear. Fear, 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 fear. Plus, we begin the complete audiobook serialization of Son of the Black Sword by Larry Correia. All right now.
Welcome to the Baen Free Radio Hour podcast. I'm Jonathan Graubard.
And I'm Allie Heilman.
We are the Baen Summer Interns. Although this is my very last day at Baen, Tony has grown weary of me and wishes for a new source of Soylent Green. Allie will still be here. For now. This week, we have a roundtable discussion about the Complete Psychotechnic League Volume 3, a collection of legendary short fiction by the 7-time Hugo Award-winning author Poul Anderson. Here to discuss it, we have Poul's daughter, Astrid Bear, her husband and renowned author, Greg Bear, and Poul Anderson expert, Sandra Miesel. And we begin the complete audiobook serialization of Larry Correia's Son of the Black Sword. Now, here's the news.
July has come about, and the Baen motherboard has delivered unto us new non-fiction and fiction on the newly designed Baen website. First up, we have short fiction by Echo Light by Tim Powers. Sebastian Vickery is minding his own business, reading a book in one psychically charged area near the Santa Monica Freeway, when he's interrupted by a young woman who goes by the name of Scout. They start talking, and soon Scout is inviting Sebastian out to lunch. But before they can break bread, Scout disappears. Now Sebastian will have to search through time to find her, and her killer, in a new story by Tim Powers, set in the world of alternate routes.
J.R. Dunn gives us a look into the future of war with his short non-fiction piece, Conflict in the South China Sea. War looms on the horizon. The course of history is impossible to plot ahead of time, but that hasn't stopped writers of science fiction from trying. Military science fiction novels have speculated about war on other worlds, in the dark recesses of space, and right here on Earth, in the Middle East, Russia, and right here in the USA. But in this month's new non-fiction article, J.R. Dunn asserts that the next major war will take place where few have thought to look, the South China Sea. Conflict in the South China Sea by J.R. Dunn and By Echolite by Tim Powers are available right now on Baen.com and will be available in perpetuity in Free Stories 2018 and Free Nonfiction 2018 on Baen eBooks.
I want to welcome you all to the Baen podcast today. We have Astrid Bear, Greg Bear, and Sandra Miesel. They have all come today to discuss the third and final volume of Poul Anderson's The Complete Psychotechnic League. For those joining us, Poul Anderson is a legendary 7-time Hugo Award-winning science fiction writer and a founder of the genre. His short fiction was a staple of the genre throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s in Astounding Science Fiction and countless other magazines. Among his many books are the High Crusades, the Time Patrol series, the Technic Civilization Saga, that includes the Dominic Flandry books, the Van Rieschen books, and more, and the Hokas series with Gordon R. Dixon. Astrid Bear, in addition to being a pillar of the science fiction community, also happens to be Poul's daughter. She is joined by her husband, Greg Bear, himself a best-selling and award-winning science fiction writer. He has written A Forge of God, Blood Music, and most recently, the Forerunner trilogy set in the Halo universe. And we also have with us Sandra Miesel. She is an American medievalist, a science fiction writer, and the world's foremost expert on Poul Anderson. She has written Against Time's Arrow, The High Crusade of Poul Anderson, Myth, Symbol, and Religion in Lord of the Rings, and The Fan as a Critic. She has also been nominated for a Hugo Award for Best Fan Writer 3 times. That was a mouthful, everyone. And we also have Tony with us. Thank you for letting me do this, Tony. And like I said again, thank you all for coming in.
Happy to be here, Jonathan. Looking forward to a good discussion.
Yes. All right. Then what I wanted to do to start the discussion off is to talk about Poul himself. For those listening who might not be as familiar with his work, I guess what would be the first thing they should know about him, about his writing?
He had the broadest range of any of the classic science fiction writers, and he was also one of the most prolific. James Blish called him the enduring explosion.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair statement. He did both hard science fiction and fantasy, even a few mysteries, as well as nonfiction, and just a wonderful prose style. His writings about nature are just poetry, and enduring characters and good plots, and hard science driving the plot as needed.
Yeah,
I think for me, in those days, Poul was a reliable friend. You could dip into any of his stories and know you were being guided through a really, as he called it, a really great yarn. And I don't know how many times I've dipped into those stories and come off being extremely impressed by his thoughtfulness, his ability to lay down a situation, his characters, and most importantly, I think, his long-range role in establishing the lives of his characters.
Yeah, and he was interested in the processes of history, which is exemplified in the books we're supposed to talk about today, the Psychotechnic League series, and even more so in the Technic Civilization series, which you can also get from Baen books.
Yeah, absolutely. It's reading the Psychotechnic League. It's kind of like a master class in political discussion and sociological speculation and realities couched in these very engaging stories.
I'd like to add a quick question. Does the Psychotechnic League, because it talks about one world government and stuff, does it predate the Technic storylines?
Yes. Yes and no. They actually emerged sort of simultaneously, because the first Technic Civilization story is 1947. And the Psychotechnic League comes up just about the same time. I don't have the publication dates of the whole thing, but the Psychotechnic League's plan was outlined in a magazine in 1955, and Poul was inspired to write a future history because Robert Heinlein had done the same thing and announced his plan and scheme. And then Poul did it, but he didn't just fill in the blanks. He worked on it on and off over the course of 21 years. And the stories are very varied in their subgenre, so to say. You have technical problem stories that would have been fine in analog. You have romantic, pulpish, high-adventure stories. And the one that's the cover story of Volume 3, Virgin Planet, is rather funny, because Poul also wrote humor. He could write the deepest tragedy and funny, rollicking humor, and poetry, and ballads, and historical novels. As I said, the man's range was tremendous.
Also, his talent. He was good at all of those things. You think of the crowd he was running with back in the 50s and 60s. They were also very good at that. But the crowd was often rotating around John W. Campbell, who published a lot of their material.
And some of these, the Psychotechnic League stories actually did appear in Astounding or Analog, but not all of them by any means. They're scattered around different magazines, pulp ones that didn't last for very long, dynamic science fiction. Who's a big fan of dynamic science fiction? But and yet one of the stories is in there.
Well, there were enormous numbers of science fiction magazines for a brief period in the 1950s, and then it all crashed down in 55. But now looking at the credit list, The Pirate, which was the last story in this series, did appear in analog in 1968.
Right.
And had a beautiful Kelly Freas cover.
Yes, it did.
So The Pirate was chronologically the last one published?
No, that's the last one. Yes, it's last one published. It doesn't fit last in the chronology. The one that's last in the chronology was published in 1953, and as Astrid just said, Dynamic Science Fiction, a rather obscure publication.
That is
the stories in this book run from 51 to 68. And then the others in the other two volumes are scattered between those 2 points.
So on the subject of those two other volumes, you guys have you've said a little bit about the premise of the Psychotechnic League as a future history of sorts, but
Yes.
But if you guys could give us a tiny bit of background or like the basic foundation where the Psychotechnic League starts.
Okay. When I was first asked to edit these 30 years ago, World War III didn't happen on schedule according to his original plan. So I asked the audience to pretend that this is an alternate history in which there was a World War III in 1958, and then we go on from there. In the internal development of the series, there is a devastating war, and then there is a desire for peace and a desire for one world government under the UN. So you get the classic story, the UN man or the unman, it's a play on words there, who is an agent of a benevolent United Nations. And at that time, late 40s, early 50s, Poul was really quite liberal in his politics, and he thought the UN was going to do great things. Well, as often happens in his long-running series, he begins to examine the premises that he set it up. And he sees that the UN is not going to work out, so he has a revolt against the one world government. He has colonization, first of the solar system, efforts by the people who are behind the UN, the Psychotechnic League, are people who have, they think, discovered the laws of human psychology and human behavior in groups to an extent they can manipulate them and predict what they can do. Well, Poul demonstrates they don't predict them very accurately because no matter what you build in a system, it will go bad. That's a principle in all his writing. It's the human side of entropy. And again, to quote James Blish, Poul says that time's arrow points in one direction only, and we must waste no time sniveling about it.
A couple of great quotes from,
James Blish, a critical essay on Poul, which was in 1974, special issue of Fantasy and Science Fiction, is well worth reading. And I do recommend if you have access to the old magazines.
Yeah, Blish was not only a very fine writer, but a remarkable critic and essayist as well. So worth reading all of his stuff.
Yes, absolutely.
My to-be read list only grows.
Yes, well, I speak, watch out, I speak in bibliographies. I lecture people in the grocery store. You have to watch out.
Well, we could do another podcast on James Blish at some point.
Oh, you should. Yeah, probably should.
Enormous.
Probably.
It's an enormous thing to crack open. But go ahead, Jonathan.
Okay, so we have the basic premise, and I guess now we start with the third volume, where we have essentially moved out of the solar system. We have hyperdrive, and now mankind has taken up to the stars. And
yes,
the Psychotechnic League is no more at this point, right?
No, it isn't. It isn't. Some of the techniques and understandings that they had have been integrated in general human knowledge, but no, they're not around anymore, and mankind is, so to speak, on its own, and it makes the same kinds of mistakes that it always did, which that this is borne out very emphatically in the Technic Civilization series, where you have an upswing and a downturn, and then the wheel turns, and ages of unification and ages of fragmentation and reunification, because man is imperfectible. That is not a popular idea now, but at the time, that was one of Poul's leading themes, the imperfectibility of man.
Well, we certainly read enough history to know that was the case. But also, there was a rush in science fiction towards finding the mental solutions to being human. You think of Korzybski and the books that were being heavily quoted and read, by A.E. Van Vogt and lots of others. And I think that Poul was always skeptical of that stuff. Although he read them,
but
he was fascinated by them, but he didn't believe them.
He knew history. He was more widely read in history than almost anybody of his time. And we should also mention that the man only died in 2000, not he was still writing right up until the time he died. There were still some posthumous things. Now, Poul got very interested in human minds downloaded into computers that you see in Harvest of Stars, and that reaches its epitome in his last masterpiece, Genesis, where all human minds get downloaded and the universe becomes a great galactic brain, but at the same time, people need to experience natural, wild nature. They cannot live as computer signals.
Well, that same question occurs when you think of long-term space travel. You know, if you're completely away from nature, and if you're in a computer environment and you're completely away from nature, how much can you remain human? And I think that was a concern that certainly interested Poul, but also a lot of us back in the 80s. It was a major question. It still is today. We still got people who believe you can be sealed up in a can for 2 to 20 years and be happy. And I think that's a major question for science fiction going forward.
He even has situations where a human becomes the intelligence of an entire planet, almost a godlike position. And, of course, when the planet's destroyed, so are you.
Right.
The writer that most influenced a lot of science fiction writers back in that time was Olaf Stapledon. And in a sense, you're kind of playing on Stapledon's giant piano here with a lot of these themes. Stapledon had intelligent galaxies. He had, miasmal vapors that were intelligent on Mars. He had all of these amazing things which science fiction writers would keep mining, a vein of gold.
Poul was a great admirer of Stapleton, and in fact, he said that his excellent hard science fiction book, Tau Zero, was deliberately inspired, consciously inspired by Stapleton and Stapleton's writing technique.
Yeah, that was one of the books that impressed me the most. But you talk about range. There are so many of Poul's books that impressed me back in the day, like Broken Sword. How can you stretch from Broken Sword to Tau Zero to the stories that are so funny and have such rich characterizations, to the kind of, not quite joke universes, but all of that would come out of his pen, his typewriter. Rarely, I think, later on his computer. I don't think he used a computer much, but I could be corrected there.
Did he use a computer, Astrid?
Not much at all. He's used to being able to rest his hands on the keyboard and nothing happening, and then on a computer keyboard you can't do that, so you get a page full of ends or whatever. So very little. But he was very fond of his IBM Selectric typewriter that he transitioned to in the 1960s.
Sorry for not talking. I'm just like, every time you mention the book, I'm like, I got to look this up on Google and see what it's about. It's
yes, you're going to read one Poul Anderson novel. Tau Zero is the one to read.
Yes, okay.
That's one of my very favorites.
Talk about the stories.
And on that note, on talking about the Psychotechnic League, I was hoping we could start with the longest story in this collection, Virgin Planet. Because you mentioned funny, and this is a very funny story. Especially with the fact that this is a world entirely completely filled with women who propagate through parthenogenesis. And there's one guy, and the first man arrives, and they also worship the men who should one day come and bring them to the stars. And this one guy arrives, and he's like, you are too hairy and ugly to be the man. You are a monster. And we just talk about that for a second. That was just very funny to me.
Okay. Well, the story was considered rather naughty in its day, and it was originally published in Fantasy and Science Fiction's sister magazine Venture, where they had the slightly edgier material. Had a beautiful inch cover. But it's quite funny, and you certainly have heroic women warriors in it, if anybody is interested in heroic women warriors.
Absolutely. And a few things struck me reading it. I hadn't read it in a long time. So as Jonathan said, they're reproducing by parthenogenesis. It was a colony ship of women going out to a planet to meet the colony of men that went first, basically. And the planet was okay, so they decided to send the women. Remember, this was written in 1957, folks. And so their ship crashes. Things go haywire, and the ship crashes on another planet that just happens to be habitable for them. And then 200 or 300 years later, this guy comes. So they've been on the ship. And they had capability of being able to reproduce by parthenogenesis. And of the number of women that were on the ship to begin with is, let's say, 200. I forget, but they're all clones of each other, and they're known by their last names as, here's a Udall, here's a Mackenzie, or so on, and so they all look alike, and they have kind of similar. This particular strain might be prone to athleticism, and this particular strain might be prone to artistry, and so on. So you can kind of tell something about somebody just by looking at them. And it reminded me in Neil Stephenson's recent book, Seven Eves, where humanity is reduced down to these 7 women that are up on a spaceship, and you get lines that are descended from them. Eventually they start able to bring in men as well, so it becomes more variation. But the idea of there being genetic types that have certain attributes and talents that are passed on is noted in Virgin Planet as well.
Cool. Yeah, it's not the first story in this collection, but it is the one, it's on the cover, and it's just it's the closest thing to like a full-on adventure in this book, and I really liked it.
Yes.
So there is that. and then moving on from that, you guys, I think Astrid, you said you wanted to talk about
first one. Exactly. So those are very much boys' adventures, and they're told from the viewpoint of a roughly 10-year-old boy. He's there with he's been sent to this planet, kind of frontier planet, to stay with his aunt and uncle, and he's off doing stuff, getting into trouble, and yet the story, it all ends well, because it's a young boy's adventure. But what really struck me was in The Acolytes, the first story, is there are these beings that they call the tinklers that make these lovely chiming sounds that the settlers, have kind of dismissed as being unimportant, but he is led by them off into the woods, and plot ensues. But the idea of a child being led into the woods on an alien planet by something that fills your mind with dreams of fairy and delight leads us straight to The Queen of Air and Darkness, which is one of his classic stories that was an award winner and has very strong similarities to that.
Yeah, I got to play the Queen of Air and Darkness at a masquerade one year.
That's right. That was spectacular.
So I have a great love of that story too. And the planet Nerthus shows up in a number of the other stories.
Yeah, I noticed that. Having established this nice planet, then it's good to have it as a jumping-off point.
For those of us who do not know about the Queen of Air and Darkness,
it was a Hugo and Nebula winner from it was printed in 1974. 72, I'm sorry, 72, because it won the Hugo and the Nebula in 73. And it's very beautiful. It's based on Scandinavian legends of the Hulda folk, the hidden folk in the hills who will kidnap human children and raise them among elvish people. And of course, they're never fully human, and they think they're having a wonderful time, but Poul exposes that is not suitable for human beings and is in fact destructive. So his character, which is based on his lead character in that, based on Sherlock Holmes, destroys the illusion and changes the balance of life on that planet.
There's a great mining of Scandinavian material from by Poul Anderson, of course, in throughout his career. This is his ancestry, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. His family was from Denmark. His mother was born in Denmark. His father was born in the U.S., but his parents were from Denmark, and they maintained contact with family. I just had a visit from my Danish cousin this spring, and so he was very informed by the Scandinavian mythology and history. He grew up speaking Danish. It was a bilingual household, and so yes, it was very much a part of his whole being.
He could translate from Old Norse Icelandic. He translated some of the skaldic poems very nicely.
Yes. Yeah. There's a lovely small volume called Staves that includes some of those translations as well as some of his original poetry that's worth seeking out.
Well, there's also, of course, a version of Rolf Krake Saga.
Based on Rolf Krake Saga, and one of the old classic Norse sagas. That is really, really well done because he is duplicated the mood and the feel down to the kind of language that they would use. The vocabulary is something that a person writing a saga could have used, whereas the Broken Sword, which also does that, is based on Volsunga Saga and is extremely grim. It's probably the grimmest novel he ever wrote, and he was afterwards a little abashed that I don't write like that anymore. And be sure you get the second edition, not the first edition. You got the second edition where he line edited the whole thing and improved it a great deal. Yes, I don't know of any other example of that where he changed everything. Just slight edits to the wording, and there was one scene recast, but it improves it because it was the first thing he wrote. It's not necessarily the first thing that was published, but it was the first thing that he had written, and obviously over the years his style improved, and he wanted to take advantage of that. So the second edition is the one you want to read. I wrote an article about this and actually compared page by page the changes.
Oh,
it's really an amazing editing job.
Greg, did you ever do that? Did you ever go back and change something?
Oh yeah. I think most writers have done that at one point or another with early novels. I don't go back and endlessly edit them. Copy editing is about the best you can hope for in some cases. But how much did Poul rewrite over the years other stories? When we were going through Karen's collection, we found many notes and lots of copy edit notes on stories that were going to be reprinted after Poul died. But I don't find Poul's major revisions going on. Sandra, do you know that? How that would work for him?
I didn't know that. The only other revision I know about is Midsummer Tempest. He changed the dialect. The hardback edition has one character speaking in very heavy Somerset dialect, and he changed it a little bit so it didn't look so intimidating. But the job that's done on the Broken Sword, it literally is a line editing of the entire book with the recasting of one scene. And occasionally he would catch errors. The Man Who Counts, the first paperback edition, had left out a key line of dialogue which throws the whole scene off, and that is replaced in later editions. But I didn't know about other rewritings.
Okay.
Can we talk about the green thumb for a moment to get back to the collection? Now, this is a sort of a fairy story recast of science fiction, is it not? I mean, it's also something you see in several of his stories, which is aliens sort of having their own lessons to teach humans who had better listen.
Oh, yes. Now, John Campbell was notorious for believing that no alien could be superior to a human. Poul did not share that opinion. He actually created, I think he knew human history better than John Campbell. He created aliens that were actually superior to humans, the Ithrians in the Technic Civilization series, and I can't remember the name of the lion-like creatures in Firetime that were deliberately designed to have powers beyond humans. So he was not a creature of John Campbell as some of his fellows were. That this alien farm worker is not exactly what he pretends to be, and yet you don't until the end. Now he revisits that situation and reverses it in another story called The Peregrine, which is a short novel where the aliens the people pretending to be native aliens are not. Whereas in the Green Thumb, the aliens are pretending to be native to that planet. Anyway, I think I confused myself there, but go on.
On this subject of the Psychotechnic League, I should wait for Astrid. I think you were trying to say something a minute ago.
Oh, just that the alien in the Green Thumb ends up turning the tables in a very neat and tidy way, and it said well done story because of that. And a lot of the stories do have, the tables kind of being turned on somebody, and people get their comeuppance who deserve it, and so on. So there's a good dynamic flow to these stories that is just, they're wonderful to read.
Biotechnology is a feature in a lot of these. The aliens are using natural processes instead of machine technology, and therefore their view of the universe is quite different from ours. And he has a number of stories like that.
And the child is the one that can actually see through and understand. He's in the Green Thumb in particular, which is a beautiful little story with a wonderful little twist. The child is the one that can actually see the alien for who he is.
And speaking of comeuppances, the story that comes after Virgin Planet in the table of contents here, Toucan is, oh my God, does this guy get a comeuppance? Definitely informed by historical practices in the Western Hemisphere.
Yes, it's Mesoamerican, pre-Columbian Mesoamerican, and it's an example of a story told from the point of view of a not very admirable character. It's not a hero.
Exactly.
He's a protagonist, but he's very definitely not a hero, and he comes to an appropriate end.
That's right.
I like that. That is like the nicest way I've ever seen somebody say he gets what's coming to him. An appropriate end. It's such a polite way of saying yes. Anyway, and on the subject of not exactly comeuppance, but we're talking about shifting dynamics. I would like to talk about I think what was the most interesting story for me in this collection, that was the pirate. Mm-hmm. Because you also said that this was the last one that he wrote in this universe, right?
Yes. Yes, it was.
Interesting to me reading all of these stories, so many of them from the 1950s, and then we come to the pirate from the late 60s. And the prose is, and not that the prose is not good in the other stories, but there's like this great leap forward in just basic prose from sentence to sentence that I was noticing in the pirate. Another 10, 15 years of work and polish definitely shows to me.
Yes, I saw the same thing when I was working on putting these together. And the pirate is very well written and has, a surprising payoff where someone gets an appropriate comeuppance.
Indeed.
And that character appears also in Peregrine.
I found that really interesting about the story. And I think this is like what I wanted to let's say, bring our conversation into toward the end is the idea, which Sandra, you wrote in a lot of the connecting pieces. Thank you for those, by the way. That there is the struggle between order and chaos is a fundamental, or I guess humanity versus entropy being a fundamental part of this of his writing philosophy, I guess.
Yes, and remember that entropy has two forms: status and chaos, and he's worked with both ends of it.
So let's look at the pirate for a second in that view, because on one hand we have Trevelyan Micah on one hand, and on the other hand we have essentially like the pirates, the entrepreneurs, whatever you want to call them, and their argument to him as he's turning the tables on them. And I'm sorry for the spoilers, I guess, but the book was written 60 years ago. That their argument to him, like, yes, we did report that there was a civilization here in the past because we're all about movement. This is the future, and we need to keep moving. And he's like, somebody needs to remember these people for what they were. And I just found that whole argument fascinating. If any of you three want to talk about that.
The pact between the living and the dead and the unborn, as the last paragraph is discussing, is lovely, and it's the tension, as you were saying, Jonathan, between moving ahead and building and creating the civilization and exploiting everything that's available, and the other of remembering art and history and civilizations that went before you that have gone away for mysterious reasons. We don't know what happened to this. Actually, we do know what happened to this planet. There was a supernova. Leaving behind great beauty that the pact of civilization requires that we preserve.
And as Chesterton said, tradition is the living memory of the dead. And Poul was certainly into tradition. He admires cultures that keep their traditions alive and do not abandon them in the name of progress. He had a lot of traditional ideas. He was also interested in the space program, for heaven's sakes, a great supporter of that. May I say something about the final story in there, which I think has tremendous emotional impact? The Last Man on Earth. The chapter ends.
Actually, is it okay if we go quickly through entity and symmetry and then get to chapter end? There are a couple of smaller pieces, but they seem to touch upon some of the similar ideas.
Well, entity and symmetry are puzzle stories in fact, Entity was in Astounding, which is now Analog. And it's how to solve a mystery that spacemen have encountered, and they do. And Symmetry is a spaceman in a seeming trap, and how can he get out of it? That absolute symmetry does not permit life.
I thought Symmetry was, that it reminded me somewhat of, it's almost allegorical in its wonderfulness, and it's funny as heck too.
It is, and it all kind of comes down to, sort of Brownian motion is solving the problem, which is kind of hilarious.
Yes, yes, because remember, Poul had a degree in physics and used
exactly. But speaking of physics degree, we came across my dad's college physics textbook and his a binder of his physics exercises. So he's working through the problems and computing orbits and mass and volume and all this kind of stuff. It's a quite amazing artifact that is ultimately going to end up at the Eaton collection at University of California, Riverside.
Oh, and he would draw and compose backgrounds for every novel in enormous detail, make little sketches of the aliens or the critters, and work out not just the orbits, but the kind of plants and animals and so forth, all of them original with beautiful and appropriate poetic names. This is very much on display in Technic Civilization series. But the final one, the chapter ends, is also a tribute to man has a unique bond with the physical environment of Earth. And this is the womb of the human race, and even if we get so advanced that we spread out into space, we are still bound as creatures who originated on Earth. And it has a very poetic language and a big emotional payoff.
It felt very Scandinavian also in
Absolutely.
Yes. And also, Poul once remarked that he got tired of people thinking that he only wrote Scandinavian characters, because at one point in the 70s, I counted, and there were as many Celtic characters or Celtic worlds as there were Scandinavian ones in his output up to that time. So he wasn't as limited, and also had a great appreciation of Asian culture, particularly Japan.
A lot of reading these two volumes, Volume 2 and Volume 3 of the Complete Psychotechnic League. There are several characters with Asian last names, and then in the 70s and 80s, he started becoming interested in Pacific Islander culture and South American culture. So you see characters from those backgrounds coming into his work as well.
Yeah, he has a short series that starts with a sort of Polynesian culture originating in New Zealand, and then
Maori and Kith.
The Maori and Kith, and the Maori being the Maori, descendants from the New Zealand people. But there's also one of the Guardians of Time stories, which is set in Peru, and there's another one in a culture that has elements of basic South American flavor to it. Those are very, very good stories. The later Time Patrol stories are just excellent. And I think that's one of his most real. Amber is one of the most fully realized and realistic female characters that he ever wrote.
Can one of y'all, for a moment, give one of the things I don't think it'll hurt the story to say the chapter ends, which I think is a beautiful capstone to the whole three-book series. It's just a wonderful tale. It's sad, melancholy, but at the same time beautiful. Can you give a little précis of what it's about? And it also goes back to what Greg said, Stapledonian in a way.
Yes. It was first published in 1953, and the situation is that Earth has to be evacuated. All the people of Earth are going to be resettled elsewhere for various geogalactic reasons, and one old man refuses to go. And the story consists of explaining why they have to go, and no, I don't want to. And so you have a depiction of man's bond with nature, and particularly our nature and our customs and our traditions. And it does seem to be taking place in a Scandinavian-flavored culture. In fact, the people have Scandinavian sort of names.
Right, and it's this lovely rural setting where they're bringing in the harvest, and the young girl goes out picking flowers in the fields, and it's this beautiful midsummer Scandinavian feel to the whole thing.
Yes, and in fact, the lead character, what is his first name? Joran. Yes, that sounds vaguely Scandinavian. But it is a lovely story, and it made the perfect bookend to the series.
Then, if that's the case, can we talk about the very ending of it? Because it seems to be almost a moment of panic.
Yes. Well, he has fought so hard to be allowed to stay behind and stay where his dead are buried, and he's in the graveyard, and he sees the graves of his parents and some of his children. I had to stay. This is my land. I am of it, and I couldn't go. Someone had to stay behind and keep the land. And then, okay, you're keeping the land, and you're keeping the land, and the loneliness that he's let himself in for really hits. Pascal's The Terror of the Infinite Spaces, the silence of the infinite spaces terrifies me, is also a theme that you find in Poul, that the galaxy is wonderful, and yet at the same time we are small, and it is great, and it's ultimately terrifying, even though we love it.
The last person on Earth, and so he's, the immensity of being the last human person on the planet that gave rise to human people. It just overwhelms him, and he's horrified and terrified, and the story ends.
One word for that is vastation, which was, I think, Henry James or Henry James's father's word for the feeling of cosmic consciousness that suddenly just leaves you as a human behind. And it's also ultimately one of the great science fiction tragic themes. There was at the end of 2001, you have this moment that kind of echoes a postcard that was sent. I have a cosmic mind. What do I do next? It was kind of a Spanish theme back in the 40s.
To his fullest extent in Genesis, his final wonderful novel that also won an academic prize, the John W. Campbell Award.
Well, we are about to run out of time, so just before we do, is there anything, like any parting words, anything that people must know about Poul Anderson that hasn't been said yet today?
I think it's probably all been said, but one can certainly restate it. He was a wonderful writer, had a incredibly wide-ranging oeuvre, everything from high fantasy to humor to the hardest of science fiction to whatever. So absolutely dive in, and the Complete Psychotechnic League series is a great place to start. And it really, because of it has such a wide breadth of time of settings of the stories, as well as when the stories were written. It really is a slice through ideas of science fiction and future history that it's a great read.
To hear something final from Greg and Astrid, just a little bit of a momentary look at Poul Anderson as a guy, since you both know him so well, of course.
Poul
He was
and
a charming
Karen.
fellow to spend time with, and
Absolutely.
loved telling jokes, and loved listening to people in their areas of expertise. I remember he was saying once that he was pleased to be as famous as he was. It was like just about the right level of fame, so that he wasn't bothered when he went out on the street or going about his daily business, but he could use that fame to get entree to the things he wanted to get entree to, which could include being at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory during planetary flybys, and being invited to be guests of honor at, he and my mother both invited to guests of honor at science fiction conventions around the world, that they were able to travel and meet fans and pros in Europe and South America and Asia, and that was a true delight to them.
And he loved to travel.
So
he was very
Absolutely.
widely traveled, and then he would use that material in the books so that there's authenticity.
The family joke of that was, we've got to write about this so we can take it off our taxes. So they would try to convert a trip into a story just so they could prove to the IRS, always a bane for Poul's existence, that they had, done the research in this trip and written a story about it and made some money off of it.
Yes, the trip to Brittany winds up in Orion Shall Rise.
Yeah.
And also the King of Eve.
Poul and Karen, Poul was always constantly kind, helpful, and supportive, and I never knew him to exert an egotistical bone in his body, but to me he was a giant because he wrote so much wonderful material that influenced me. I'm not sure I could say that I minded it, but I certainly was mindful of it. And I think that Poul and Karen together were a dyad that always was able to kind of find the research necessary. And they helped me on some of my earlier books. Poul and Karen helped figure out orbits in Eon, and Karen helped work out some of the language that takes place in the last chapter.
Yes.
And
Yes.
getting insight into all of that was just really kind of wonderful over the years that Poul was with us, and Karen too. And now we're going through the papers and finding more and more instances of their connection to science fiction, their love of science fiction, and the influence they had on it.
And the other thing, they had interests parallel to science fiction, like Sherlock Holmes fandom.
Exactly.
They were very, very fond of. Karen had founded a Sherlock Holmes group when she was a college student, and SCA, and they were among the most popular pros ever in old fandom.
They were.
Poul was ceaselessly courteous to the rudest little fan. Very. No, I could give you examples of that, but just easily approachable and courteous, perfect gentleman.
Absolutely.
For him, having a hearing aid that he could turn down helped too.
Oh, well,
there were times when you would hear a little whee go off, and he would adjust his hearing aid. And but you also know that there were times when he wasn't listening to everything that was being said. Only if he felt it was interesting did he turn the hearing aid up. He had his protective mechanisms too. But he had this constant smile that made you feel like, okay, you were being appreciated, you were there, and I think he was able to defend himself in that way.
Thank you so much for coming, and of course, Sandra, thank you for everything. I really appreciate you guys taking the time today, and for everyone else, the Complete Psychotechnic League Volume 3 is out from Baen. Also, we have the first 2 volumes, so if you get all 3, you get the entirety of this saga from start to finish.
Yes, and look in on the Technic Civilization, which Baen also publishes in many volumes.
Thank you, Jonathan and Tony, for putting this together. It's been a great discussion.
Now we begin the audiobook serialization of Son of the Black Sword by Larry Correia. After the War of the Gods, the demons were cast out and fell to the world. Mankind was nearly eradicated by the seemingly unstoppable beasts, until the gods sent them the great hero Ramruan to save them. He united the tribes, gave them magic, and drove the demons into the sea. Yet as centuries passed, gods and demons became myth and legend, and the people no longer believed. The age of law began. Ashok Vadal has been chosen by a powerful ancient weapon to be its bearer. He is a protector, a fabled member of the elite militant order of roving law enforcers. No one is more merciless in rooting out those who secretly practice the old ways. Everything is black or white, good or evil, until he discovers his entire life is a fraud. Ashok isn't who he thinks he is, and when he finds himself on the wrong side of the law, the consequences will lead to rebellion, war, and destruction. Here is the first installment of Son of the Black Sword by Larry Correia.
Audible Studios presents Son of the Black Sword, Saga of the Forgotten Warrior, Book 1. Written by Larry Correia, performed by Tim Gerard Reynolds.
Chapter 1. The familiar dream was always the same. He was on his knees, wiping a stone floor clean. The rag soaked up the red puddle, a mixture of soapy water and blood. When he wrung the tattered cloth out over his wash bucket, it ran in pink rivulets across his hands. A child's hands. A noise intruded on the dream, waking him. Footsteps. He moved one hand to his sword, and in the hazy moment between sleep and reality, it still seemed to be a child's hand, dripping with watered-down blood. But the dream faded, and reality returned. Now it was a man's hand, calloused by training and scarred by battle. That hand belonged to Protector of the Law, 20 years senior Ashok Vadal. And he did not clean blood. He spilled it. Listening carefully, Ashok decided that the noise had come from just outside his tent. A warrior had approached, then stopped there, probably to gather up his courage before waking their honored guest. Ashok relaxed and released Angru Vadal's grip. Reaching for it first was an old habit. If the sword needed to be drawn, it would have told him. The blood-scrubbing dream had come to him many times before, but as usual, it held no wisdom, no revelations. It meant nothing. After all, it was only a dream. It was a fabrication of the mind, not a memory. It was not real. The stifling heat was real. The moist, clinging air was real. He'd been sleeping beneath hanging silks because the stinging flies that infested this region were all too real. The sweaty discomfort reminded him that he was in the wretched northern jungles of House Gujara, and that he'd been ordered there to kill a demon. The waking noises of the temporary camp and the unusual silence of the jungle suggested that the demon had shown itself. The messenger hadn't announced himself yet. Ashok was used to low-status members of the warrior caste behaving this way around him, either out of respect for his office or fear of his reputation. He'd been listening to their whispered rumors for 2 decades now, half of which weren't true and the other half exaggerated, but it was no wonder messengers were always so nervous around him. It was always best to cut through the awkward pause. "Is it time?" Ashok asked through the canvas. "The demon has been sighted, Protector." "Where?" He rolled out from beneath the silks and found his clothing in the dark. "It's raiding a village on the coast right now." The warrior was trying to keep the fear out of his voice, and mostly succeeding. "The messenger said it's already slaughtered dozens." "So it's close, then?" "Yes, Protector. The demon is very close." Good. It was too damned hot to have to chase it. Ashok sprinted along the darkened path toward the sounds of screaming. His appointed escorts, a Polton of 50 warriors, were behind him, struggling and failing to keep up. The soldiers were on foot because horses didn't survive for long in the humid, muddy, vine-choked, insect-infested northern peninsula of House Gujara, so their warrior caste had no cavalry tradition here. However, when it came to fighting a demon, being on foot was not a disadvantage. Horses were terrified by demons, and no matter how well trained, could not be relied upon. Besides, for short distances such as this, Ashok could outrun a horse. He began to encounter fleeing villagers along the path. There were a few men, women, and children of the worker caste, but most of the refugees were casteless non-people. It made sense, because only the lowest of the low would be condemned to live close to the seashore. Many of those he passed were wounded, mostly from crashing through the thorny brush, but a few were showing the blackened, bloody patches that came from simply brushing against a demon's hide. Rub a hand against a demon one direction, it was smooth, almost soft. But run it the opposite, and leave your palm behind. There had been no time for the villagers to gather their possessions. Since the demon had struck in the middle of the night, most of the villagers weren't even clothed. But a few of the casteless were carrying squealing pigs or squawking chickens. Non-people were pragmatic that way. As he drew closer to the village, the fleeing crowd became thicker, and he had to dodge between them. They were terrified, desperate to escape. But he moved through the crushing mob effortlessly, like a raindrop falling from the sky and rolling between the leaves of a tree, seeking its inevitable path. Behind him there was a great deal of shouting as the warrior caste crashed into and roughly shoved their inferiors out of their way, off the path, and into the stabbing thorn vines. The village was close now. The breaking of wood and the crack and pop of fire could be heard over the panicked cries. The demon itself would make no sound. They never did. Ashok could smell smoke and blood and spilled bowels, but the demon itself would have no scent. It would be a swift, black shadow, with claws harder than steel, a mouth full of razor teeth, and the strength of an elephant. The orange light from several burning huts cast wild shadows through the trees. The thick jungle parted. There wasn't much open space between the jungle and the high tide, so the ramshackle buildings had been packed tightly, practically on top of each other, and built on stilts to keep them dry above the rocky beach. Bridges constructed of wood and hemp connected the structures, and they were swaying violently as people ran across, trying to escape the spreading fires and the demon's hunger. Beyond the village was the vast, dark ocean. Nothing came from the sea except for regret, fish, and demons. There was no sign of the demon yet, but Ashok knew it was in there somewhere. His sword could sense it as well, and Angruvadal was demanding to be drawn in order to dispense death. Not yet. Demons seemed to sense black steel, and he didn't want to frighten the creature away. If it returned to the sea, there would be no way to follow, and he'd have to wait for another chance to catch it. As he caught his breath, he noticed several warriors stationed at the end of the jungle path, shouting at the villagers to flee for their lives, as if the encouragement was needed. The soldiers were armed with spears, and wearing the simple cloth and hide armor preferred by House Gujara, where rust was a greater enemy than actual enemies. Despite being equipped for battle and raised their entire lives to do nothing but fight, they were in no hurry to enter that burning maze to take on a demon. "Go back the way you came! There's a sea demon here!" A very young soldier warned when he saw Ashok emerge from the jungle. "Run away while you can!" The firelight was flickering and unreliable, so the junior Nayak had probably not realized who he was ordering around. Ashok didn't take his warning as an insult against his courage. He entered the circle of torchlight, and when they saw his armor, they shut their mouths. "Which one of you is in command?" The soldier realized what manner of man he's been speaking to. "Apologies, Protector. Our Havildar is Virata." It was part explanation, part summons, and then he realized that, demon incursion or not, he'd better bow to someone of such high station, so he dipped his head so fast that his padded helmet fell off into the sand. "I'll fetch him." "Havildar, A protector is here! A protector? Impossible! Another warrior, gone a bit fat, came jogging up. He was too old to hold the low rank of Havildar, a leader of 10, but of course, a great house would only send the dim and disgraced from among its warrior caste to protect a cursed holding such as this. Our house has abandoned us! We're all going to die here! There's no... The ornate armour of the Protector Order should have been a giveaway, but Ashok showed him the token of his office, so there could be no question about who was now in charge. The officer's eyes widened when he saw the gold flash in the firelight. "Take me to the sea demon," Ashok said. "I can't," the officer wailed. Ashok couldn't believe his ears. The law was clear about both of their duties in this situation. "Are you disobeying my order?" His tone was cold. "Calm yourself and speak carefully before you answer." "No, Protector. It was... I don't know. I saw it reach through old Ravner's stomach, take hold of his spine and pull his head right through his shoulders. Such a thing can't be real. I ordered a retreat because we had to run. I had no choice." That babbling didn't answer Ashok's question. The Havildar was stupid with fear. Demons could shatter even a great warrior's courage, and he was fairly certain this man had never been counted among House Gujara's great to begin with. "Calm yourself and tell me, where is the demon?" The Havildar cowered. "Too strong. Too much blood. I can't. Won't go back." In a time of crisis, some men might shirk their duties, but to a protector, obedience was everything, and the law required him to punish this demon for trespassing. He couldn't do it if they were lollygagging around while it swam back to sea, so Ashok backhanded the warrior in the mouth, hard enough to loosen a few teeth from his jaw. The officer fell in the sand, whimpering. "Where?" "We saw it in the storehouse," interjected the young soldier before Ashok could put his boot to the Havildar. He was pointing into one of the larger fires. "Past that big building there. Last I saw, the demon was heading toward the casteless quarter, that direction." The casteless were not people. They were property. But they looked enough like real men that the sea demon probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference. Ashok could only assume that non-people tasted the same as real people to a demon. "It was huge. I had to duck to get through the big storehouse door." The junior soldier lifted one hand as high as possible, stretching it over his head, and even stood on his toes. The Nayak was tall, nearly as tall as Ashok, in fact. Even allowing for some exaggeration from the terror of seeing such a thing, that meant this demon was a big one. The larger demons that bothered to come up on shore were particularly bloodthirsty, and their raiding period could often last an entire season. If it wasn't stopped tonight, then its rampage would continue, night after night, until it was killed or sated. It would take a few minutes for this 50-man escort to catch up, and when they did, they would be too out of breath to be immediately useful. The demon would surely sense the arrival of that many soldiers and might decide to leave. It couldn't be allowed to escape. "Reinforcements are coming. Tell the Rizaldar in charge that I've gone after it." "Alone?" Ashok drew the ancestor blade of great House Vidal from the sheath on his belt. And Gru Vidal was eager. The sword retained the collected martial instincts of every man who had ever carried it into battle, all in a length of metal so black that it absorbed the light around it, and so sharp that it could even pierce the hide of a demon. The Nayak realized what it was and took a fearful step back. "I am never alone."
That was the first entry in the complete audiobook serialization of Son of the Black Sword by Larry Correia. And that's it for the podcast. Thanks to Audible.com and to podcast theme composer Ruth Jutkowitz.
And a cosmic goodbye to Astrid and Greg Bear and Sandra Miesel. And thanks and applause for our discussion on the Complete Psychotechnic League Volume 3 by Poul Anderson. Please join us here next time at the hammering heart of science fiction and fantasy, and as always, keep reaching for the stars.